because the president prizes his sort of decision making and autonomy so highly, because he wants to be the decider and he wants to maintain that ambiguity about like what will he accept, what will be good enough. That's his negotiating strategy. That means that even when something like the Europeans are sitting down with Donald Trump's team, they can't even really negotiate the details because even Trump's team doesn't know if at the end of the day a package will be acceptable for him or not.
Hi, I'm Joe Crawford, and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today, I'm joined by Dmitry Grozoubinski, Director of Explained Trade and author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, we've heard Trump say that this US EU trade deal was the biggest deal ever made. He said it would be great for cars and big impact on agriculture. What do you make of this?
Well, I think the headline finding is that it looks like we're going to avoid trade stopping tariffs of 30% plus on Friday. That is the thing that will be making markets and businesses take a big, big breath out that they've been holding on for weeks. With that said, we are now discovering that it's not even entirely clear what they actually agreed, and differences are already emerging between the EU and the US on various details and what's covered. So I would probably avoid too many fireworks and superlatives in describing it.
And when you mentioned there about discrepancies, we've heard that Trump, on the one hand, is claiming that a vast amount of US military equipment is going to be purchased by the US. But then we've had senior EU officials say that this wasn't part of the agreement. What else is there in terms of discrepancies?
Well, to give your listeners a sort of peek behind the curtain, what we normally do when we negotiate trade agreements is we spend a huge amount of time trying to nail down exactly what we mean on each issue. Like, what exactly are we saying when we say purchase military equipment? How much? Over how long? How will that work? Or what do we mean when we say, pharmaceuticals are included or excluded? In this case, they kind of seem to have skipped all of that and just gone to the press release stage. And so now we're getting disagreements on things like they announced this, I think, a $600 billion investment target. Well, the European Commission doesn't control investment. It can't make anyone invest in anything. So what are they talking about? Do they mean that this is an aspirational goal? 600 billion over how long? Europeans already invest about 180 odd billion dollars into the US every year just because there are some good investments in the US. So if we multiply that by about 3 for the remainder of Donald Trump's term, we get to about 600 billion, but that's about as much of a commitment as promising that the sun's going to rise tomorrow morning. Or do they mean 600 billion new investment? Over how long? Do they mean in a year? Do they mean in 10 years? So all of these things are emerging where it's not clear that they have a shared understanding of what it is the two sides are pinky promising.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think that this has moved at such speed? And we've got that deadline of the 1st of August. There's also an argument there that is this the EU trying to sort of maintain a good relationship with Trump, especially in terms of protecting EU Ukrainian security?
Well, these negotiations have been very different to what we ordinarily do. Normally, trade's working pretty well, and when we sit down to negotiate something like a free trade agreement, what we're doing is just trying to improve the status quo a little bit. There's no looming sense of urgency. We can take our time. We'll sometimes set deadlines just to try to push ourselves a little bit, but everyone knows nothing really happens if you happen to miss one of those. In this case, the Trump administration is doing something very different. It's creating these swords of Damocles where it's saying, by August 1st, we're going to implement these massive tariffs. You have to negotiate with us. And then internally, because the president prizes his sort of decision making and autonomy so highly, because he wants to be the decider and he wants to maintain that ambiguity about like what will he accept, what will be good enough. That's his negotiating strategy. That means that even when something like the Europeans are sitting down with Donald Trump's team, they can't even really negotiate the details because even Trump's team doesn't know if at the end of the day a package will be acceptable for him or not. And so what that means is everyone sort of chats for a while, and then the deadline gets really close. The president has a phone call with the leader or the head of the commission or the president, the prime minister, and they have like an hour conversation in which they're supposed to nail everything down. And the president is not necessarily a detail oriented kind of thinker. He's a big picture guy. And so what you end up happening is with the deadline days away, you have this sort of broad outline, which they immediately announce to the press. And then they kind of try to backfill the details afterwards. And that is, I think, why you're getting the kind of weird, confusing optics you're seeing that you wouldn't normally get in a traditional trade negotiation.
Ursula von der Leyen, she's the European Commission chief. She said that a deal would bring stability to trade. But then on the other hand, we're hearing from several European leaders about this deal, pushing back. We've got Hungarian PM Viktor Orban saying that this is not an agreement. Trump ate von der Leyen for breakfast. We've got the German Chancellor Merz saying that this will substantially damage his nation's finances. We had Professor Scott Lucas on yesterday for the Trump report, and he said that this trade deal is not a victory for anyone. Nobody wins a tariff contest. Do you think that anyone is coming out victorious from this deal?
No, I don't think anyone's coming out with a victory. There's not a lot to celebrate here. Ursula von der Leyen is correct in saying that this creates more stability than existed 2 days ago. Let's be clear, at least in the short term, there's a reasonable hope that we won't get 30% tariffs. And as long as this deal holds, businesses will at least have some level of confidence that they will know what tariffs are next week, which they didn't before. With that said, for all of the reasons we've talked about already, there are plenty of ambiguities in this deal that mean that on any given morning, the president can wake up and say, hey, this deal is working great. I love it. Yay, kumbaya, friends forever. But equally, he can decide that the deal is not being implemented in good faith, that there is a grievance to be had, and to go back to the tariff drawing board and to start issuing threats and tariffs again. So it has avoided the immediate 30% tariff threat. It has created a little bit more stability than existed a week ago. And it has, I suppose, created a additional cost for the president if he wants to hit Europe with tariffs again. But I think the professor is absolutely right. I don't think this is a win for anybody. At the end of the day, US consumers are going to pay a higher tax for goods they wanted to buy. US companies and a huge amount of EU-US trade is intra-corporate and intermediate goods. So the things that US factories need to make other products, those are going to be more expensive. So the US is going to become less competitive. At the same time, Europeans are going to lose business and they're going to lose sales. And everyone is going to have to do a mountain more paperwork at the border. So I don't think this is a triumph for anyone, but I can see why the Commission felt compelled to do it. And on the statements of European leaders, I think the British public would be very, very familiar with the idea of having the Commission do something that is necessary, but will be unpopular, so that you can afterwards come out and sort of go, well, I'll accept it, but I don't like it. And I think that's a lot of what is happening here. The idea that the Commission would do a deal that the Germans weren't on board with is frankly fanciful. So I think behind closed doors, the member states were like, yeah, okay, go on ahead and do this, knowing full well that they were then going to send tweets and give press conferences in which they sort of try to distance themselves from it, even as they quietly breathe the sigh of relief that it happened.
We need to have the 27 EU members all agree to this deal, don't we, in order for it to go through? So I presume you think that this deal will go through.
I suspect ultimately that it will. The exact inner workings of the European Union aren't my department. It depends on how they sort of structure various aspects of the deal, whether the Commission has sole competency or mixed competency. It all gets very, Kremlinology very, very quickly. But my understanding is that yes, sort of the deal enjoys the support of the member states. tacitly, if not publicly. Um, no. Viktor Orban reading people lectures on not bowing to dictators is certainly a novel new direction for Viktor.
I'm interested as well in the oil and energy part of this as well. So the deal includes the EU buying $750 billion of US energy over 3 years. I mean, in comparison, Russia's energy sales to the EU totaled $23 billion last year. Politicos say that in theory, this is going to be a huge win for the US for their oil and gas firms. But in practice, it's going to be unworkable. The EU, they do have a plan to try and eliminate its dependence on Russian energy by 2027. But with what we're seeing with this trade deal so far, do you think that that's potentially going to become a reality?
So I think total EU energy imports last year were around 280 billion. That's everything from everywhere. Um, Now, if you kind of do simple math, in order to reach a target of 700, they would basically have to convert 100% of their energy imports into buying US oil and LNG and nuclear fissionable material. That doesn't work. So a bunch of their power plants don't run on that. It's not so the actual number isn't unfeasible. I don't know how they came up with it. I can't imagine there is any chance they will reach it. Now, what you can imagine is the EU trying to wean itself off that final dependence on Russian oil and natural gas, which, as you said, is a much more modest figure, though 30 billion is still a lot of money, by buying it from the US instead. Um, Now, that would be a win for US firms somewhat, but it is also really important to remember that these things are globally traded commodities, traded on a kind of a global market. And it's not like the US was particularly struggling to sell natural gas or oil before. It's now the US is the Saudi Arabia of gas. It's also kind of the Saudi Arabia of oil now. So this will probably see slightly increased prices, slightly increased demand for the US, but it's not going to be some transformational thing that turns Texas into Wakanda.
And domestically, in terms of the impact that these tariffs will have on US citizens, how do you think that this will impact Trump's reputation with the US population?
It's really hard to say. I mean, this certainly, if you look at the outline of the deals he's doing, this allows him to tell the story he wants to tell, which is that for the first time, an American president has gotten tough with our trading partners. We've leveraged the strength of the American economy, and we have secured all of these concessions. It gives him very big numbers to announce. I think he had 600 billion with Saudi Arabia. Now he's got 600 billion with the EU. He had like $500 billion with Japan. It gives him very big numbers that sort of reinforces his, I suppose, the image he's trying to paint of himself as a proactive deal maker going out there and bringing home the bacon for the American people. And I think that he'd be very happy about that. And a lot of the reasons things are playing out the way they are is that is the story he wants to tell. And that's sort of he begins from that story and then he builds the agreements around it. So I think that could play well. On the other hand, I mean, it's a massive tax increase on Americans. And this is a president who ran on lowering costs on supermarket shelves, at the petrol pump, what have you. He ran on lowering inflation and he ran on an industrial revival. Now, I don't think these tariffs or these deals are going to lead to an acceleration of the industrial revival of the United States. To the extent that there is new investment in the US that wasn't happening already, it will create very few jobs because they'll be heavily automated factory jobs for people with, two master's degrees from MIT to run a bunch of robots. And at the end of the day, people are going to start to feel this as shops begin to pass on tariffs to people. So a lot will basically depend on whether the narrative wins out over people's perception of how far their paycheck goes and the general vibe of the country. At the moment, the approval ratings for the president have been trending down in categories like the economy and tariffs. and it's not clear that this will turn them around.
And looking more generally, we've got that deadline of the 1st of August coming up in a few days. What can we expect to see with the rest of these trade negotiations?
So it looks like 15% looks like it's going to be kind of a little bit of a base rate for almost everyone. I think we're going to see an absolute flurry of activity for some of the larger economies who still don't have a deal. If you are South Korea, for example, you're now looking at a US auto market where your largest competitors in Japan and in Europe enjoy 15% tariffs, while you're sitting somewhere at 27 plus. So there's a lot of incentive for them to go and get a deal. And what these deals with Europe and Japan have revealed is that the price for that deal may not be too high. You just have to invent a large number and sort of announce it. So I think we're going to see countries like South Korea, Singapore, Switzerland sort of scrambling to see if they can get a deal done. And then I suspect in August, what you're going to see is some sort of broad-based tariff of about 15% imposed on almost everyone, with perhaps higher tariffs on individual products and perhaps some individual countries that give the president bad vibes.
When we go back to Liberation Day, do you think that Trump expected the outcome that we're potentially expecting over the next few days?
No, I don't necessarily know that he thought this far ahead. One of the big challenges in predicting the Trump administration and trying to create a coherent story about the Trump administration and trade is that really Donald Trump had four objectives. He had the idea of raising revenue, he had the idea of creating negotiating leverage, he had the idea of reshoring manufacturing, and he had the idea of combating China, dependence on China. And over the last sort of 5, 6 months, he has repeatedly pivoted between those as one seemed to be harder or one seemed to be create more opportunities or a better story to tell. And so I think the Peter Navarro tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day were much more about reshoring manufacturing and addressing the trade deficit and potentially doing some negotiations to open up other markets. But the pushback against that, the market reaction, the sort of chaos of it all, the fact that the tariffs were distributed in a really stupid way, and the fact that they gave him no ammunition to go after countries that did have a trade deficit with the US, like Brazil, has made him sort of turn on that idea and instead focus on raising revenue through a 10 to 15% tariff, which is enough to make a bunch of money for the US, add a bit to inflation, but not prevent trade or crash the global economy. And at the same time, he's sort of looking for individual opportunities to use these tariffs as a cudgel by sort of saying, well, if I give everyone 15% and I threaten somebody with 50, that's really scary. So I don't think he was expecting this, but I think he was fully aware of how powerful a weapon he had in the US tariff code. And he likes using that weapon and he likes the flexibility it gives him.
Is it the art of the deal? You know, that's what his book's about. That's what he says. Is this the businessman that we all think that Trump is?
So it's really interesting if you read The Art of the Deal, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But you know, if you have morbid curiosity or a strong masochistic streak and you read it, a lot of the negotiations he talks about are effectively sort of real estate deals, and especially negotiating with his contractors, where he is in an overwhelmingly powerful position and he's doing a one-time economic transaction. Someone sent him an invoice for marble in the toilets. He wants to pay half of what's on that invoice, and he refuses to pay until they reduce the invoice because he's big, he has the money, and he never has to work with these people again. Why I think the Trump administration has sort of failed to art of the deal in terms of too many actually meaningful concessions from partners, why they haven't been able to achieve a lot of what they'd hoped, is that negotiating with other governments is very, very different. Other governments know that they have domestic constituents who are looking at them, watching what they're doing, and will punish them if they are seen to give away too much. With other governments, when you're negotiating, implementation is as important as what's agreed on the day. So if you completely alienate them, if you're a jerk, then they can sort of forget to implement anything you agree. And frankly, the power imbalances, though the US is incredibly powerful, just aren't as stark as when you are a hotel developer and you are talking to a small business that has, a whole wall of outstanding invoices it owes for the marble, and you're refusing to pay out on their work. The power differences just aren't the same. And so governments have been able to push back considerably more, which is why we've seen the Trump administration sort of retreat to largely cosmetic or impressive sounding concessions like investment that don't mean anything, plus this 15% tariff that he thinks he can make them swallow.
Dmitry, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much for having me.